Hello, everybody. Welcome. Hopefully, you're all doing well and everything is going fine during these trying times. Um, Today, we're going to talk about international relations. Just as a reminder, as the screen share is getting started, that if there's anything that you need help with from your teacher, whether it's regarding content or the assignments, please do reach out to us. We are here to support you. So today we're going to talk about international relations, how those relationships are developed, and then talk about some different perspectives on how these relationships form and what's basically the best way to move forward. So let's start off by talking about how people and countries interact with each other. Basically, there's three different things that influence our lives on both a national and international level. Obviously, if we were looking within Canada, there's going to be more things that influence our lives. But these are factors that influence not just your lives here, but they're influencing other people's lives in other parts of the world. And those people can influence us and we can influence them. So the first is that states, right? So national governments can influence other national governments to act in certain ways. So the United States, through its diplomatic relations with Canada, can ask Canada to do certain things, and Canada, may or may not have to do them, but certainly it will influence our lives, right? So you can look at something like the invasion of Afghanistan, where the United States went to its allies and said, look, we need you to do this. And consequently, countries like Canada joined in the fight. And so we sent soldiers to go fight in Afghanistan, right? So it certainly influenced people's lives here, the state to state relationship that exists between Canada and the United States and Canada and other countries. Markets also influence our lives, right? And that's really a key thing that you get from Social 10 with looking at globalization and how marketplaces in one part of the world influence what we have here, right? So just look at what's going on right now with this whole COVID thing. The fact that we have sourced our medical gear and our protective gear from China for the last few decades now has become a problem for us, and we can't really get as much material as we need, and it's really hard to scale up. So markets influence people around the world, and as the world has become more globalized and barriers to trade through things like tariffs have become lowered, these impacts are even greater than before. And then the last thing is civil society. And civil society could be things like you on social media. You're talking with other people, and that would be something from grade 10 where you looked at communications technologies and you looked at media and you looked at the influence of how what's going on in one part of the world can influence what people in another part of the world are doing. We'll talk more about this here in a second, but essentially that's what it comes down to, is these connections between actual people that create a sense of a global society. So the question is, what should be the balance of this influence? So some people argue that, perhaps the state should become less important as transnational corporations grow and make interconnections. And they would argue that markets are the most efficient ways to decide what resources get made where and by whom and who gets access to those resources. There'd be detractors who would say, look, something like a case like this just goes to show us that Canada should indeed have some manufacturing capacity, and the state should be important, and we can't just leave everything up to corporations to decide because, look, there's no accountability. from the people, in the sense like there is, I guess, some accountability from shareholders, but there's no democratic accountability. And so when we look at things like the environment, the state has an important role to play. And so the idea here that you want to be getting at is, what is the mix or the balance that should exist between these different influences on our lives, and what should be the most important players when it comes to international relations. So let's talk a little bit more about civil society and what that means. So civil society is the collective actions of people based on shared interests. And so people who have the same ideas can get together and they can try and take action on an issue. So this could be a political party, this could be a union, this could be people who volunteer for a non-governmental organization, maybe a group that cares about something like animal welfare. So civil society is just people getting together, trying to take some action based on their shared beliefs and their shared interests. And global civil society is talking about groups of people around the world who get together to try and take action on some issue. And this is without any coercion from any outside body. So this is just people getting together, trying to make change. And this could include, and now this is important, so it's not only citizens, but it's also nations or groups who are willing to contribute to the betterment of an international community or cause. So this could be people getting together to try and make change. It could be people in conjunction with certain governments. Okay, so you might have individuals working and acting with actual national governments. And maybe they're actually even working with some groups as well. So some non-governmental organizations, right? So you could take an issue like climate change. There may be people who are active and involved who are just regular everyday citizens. There may be some states that care about climate change enough that want to interact with those people and try and make change. And there may be groups or organizations that are concerned about this who might also try and work together as well. Okay, so it's people trying to make change, working together. That is civil society. Um, Okay, so with that, we can also talk about the role of international organizations in trying to take action. So intergovernmental organizations. Oh, and yeah, there we go. Oh, well, we're getting there. Um, So there's going to be two different types of international organizations, and so some of those organizations that try to take action on these issues are going to be what we're going to call intergovernmental organizations. So they're governments working with other governments. And some of those organizations are going to be non-governmental organizations. So those are organizations that are working without direct interference from the government. But in general, what all international organizations are trying to do is address a problem. So they've identified a problem that needs to have something done about it, and they get together to try and create change. Okay. And so whether we're talking about an international organization like NATO or the United Nations, or so those are IGOs, intergovernmental organizations, or whether we're talking about non-governmental organizations, things like the Red Cross or Amnesty International, all of them were created with a problem in mind, something that needed to be addressed. So if you think back to grade 10 and you think about something like the World Trade Organization, it was an organization that was created with a problem, which was too many countries would be looking out for their own economic prosperity, sometimes at the expense of other countries. And this led to conflict, right? Conflict that existed in World War I and World War II. And so the goal of the World Trade Organization was to create interdependency through trade so that conflict could not escalate to war. right? So that was the problem. The problem was, how do you create economic prosperity for people? And how do you create economic prosperity in such a way that other people are not being harmed by the actions of another country, right? And that there's rules, I guess, as well. That's another thing, right? So that there's rules that can be followed, so that when there are disputes, we know how to solve those issues, right? So you've got to have a problem that leads to the creation of an organization. Take something like Amnesty International. You've got a problem like there are human rights abuses that are occurring around the world, and sometimes, because of the relationships that exist between states, some governments might not be able to pressure these authoritarian regimes as much as concerned citizens would like to, right? And so, how do we advocate for the rights of these people who are locked up in authoritarian regimes, where perhaps the state to state relationship means that we can only speak so far towards those concerns. So we've got a reason to create this organization. Now, some organizations' mandates have changed over time. So you can think about something like the World Bank and the IMF, that were originally created to help distressed economies after World War II, to try and bring back war-torn European countries. The World Bank and the IMF still exist today, even though World War II and the economic consequences, or at least the worst economic consequences, have kind of uh, been addressed. So what do they do now? Well, the World Bank provides, loans to developing countries to develop their their resources, for example. And so sometimes organizations' mandates change over time, right? And so you want to think about that. What was the issue that led to the creation of the organization, and how has that mandate changed over time? And so these organizations are all transcending international boundaries. So they try to work beyond just what's going on in one nation, and they seek to try to empower or broaden people's perspectives. They try to allow more informed decision making to happen in a democracy, right? So that can be a purpose as well. And they contribute to a global civil society. And so those are the things that these organizations are trying to accomplish and trying to achieve. And there's two different types, as we mentioned, right? So there's intergovernmental organizations, and these are set up by formal agreements between nation states, right? So governments get together and they decide to create an organization, and these are formally agreed to setups, right? So take something like NATO, which was a military alliance um, that the idea was that if one nation was attacked, all would defend, and the idea was based on this concept that perhaps nations like the Soviet Union would try to invade some part of Europe, and some of these countries are quite small, and so how would we prevent a country like Italy from being invaded by the Soviet Union? Well, Italy might not stand a chance by itself, but with France and the United Kingdom and the United States and Canada, they would have some way of doing so. So there's a formal agreement that's set up to create these organizations. Obviously, the most best known intergovernmental organization is the United Nations. So there are also non-governmental organizations, and these are organizations that operate without direct influence from a government. So an example could be the Red Cross, right? No government controls what the Red Cross does. Now, again, there's this idea of direct interference, because sometimes organizations, NGOs, can be influenced by governments, but they're usually through indirect means. So, for example, there are NGOs that are trying to help people in the developing world um, with many different issues. So let's say family planning, right? So trying to teach people, sex education and things of this nature. But in the United States, there are issues that are and they're still controversial here in Canada, but far more so in the United States, with something like abortion, where it's an issue before the courts and the political leadership, and there's big debates in the United States about what to do with it, far more than exists here. So, anyways, when there's a change in government in the United States that's more pro-abortion or against abortion, they can create rules about who the American government is going to give funding to, which non-governmental organizations will receive money from the American government to do the work that they do overseas. So, depending on the stance of abortion, your organization may or may not get funding. And so, if the political parties change power in the United States, you as a non-governmental organization, you may be forced to adapt or change to those policies so that you can receive money or funding. So we're talking about direct influence here, or interference by a government in these NGOs. The NGO doesn't have to make those changes, but they sometimes do so that they can get more aid from governments. They can get more donations from people. They can get access to certain countries. So a country like Russia often will deny entry to non-governmental organizations because they're worried about the way that they might sort of chip away at the authoritarian regime that exists in Russia. So you as an NGO, if you want to operate there, you might be willing to change your rules or change your stance on an issue so that you can at least gain access, right? So we're talking about, it's not to say that they operate in this world where there is no rules or consequences or influence. Certainly all those things exist. It's just not a direct interference by a government. Okay, and they have a mission, a clear purpose, just like intergovernmental organizations. Usually, NGOs have voluntary members, which gives them a diverse demographic. Okay, and there are different types of NGOs. So, for example, humanitarian relief. This is like there's a disaster, there's an earthquake, a hurricane. You come in and help. Peace and disarmament. So this could be like, let's say there are organizations designed to try and get rid of landmines, because landmines actually don't usually kill soldiers. They usually kill children. And so when the conflict ends, you need somebody to go in and take out all these landmines so that people don't lose limbs and don't lose their lives. Human rights is another type of commitment that organizations will have. Development, so that's talking about improving economic conditions or health conditions in the developing world, and then the environment. Okay, so those are the different types of goals or focuses that non-governmental organizations have. They're usually nonprofit, though they're not always. They're usually non-religious. That doesn't mean that they aren't that they don't have a religious foundation. It's just that they're not trying to proselytize, right? So the Red Cross, I mean, it has the symbol of Christianity in its name and in its logo, but the Red Cross isn't going around and trying to convert people to Christianity, right? So its actions are secular. And they're usually pacifist, so they are trying not to create conflict, but diffuse conflict and trying to promote peace. Usually they will create declarations. So these are a set of principles on which governments should be basing their action. Or basically it's a list of, here's what we believe we should do. Okay. All right. So just as a quick review of liberal internationalism, remember that the ideology behind liberal internationalism starts with the idea that all people are capable of rational thought. Doesn't mean we always rationally think, but we're all capable of it. And if you're a rational thinker and you should be able to decide your future, like, how am I going to improve myself? What plans do I need to make tomorrow so that my life can be better? Then you want to make sure that other people also have the ability to control their own lives. And so it demands that we see that all people are capable of rational thought, and it demands tolerance of us. And if we think that we should be able to control our own future, then other people should be able to control their own future as well. And so there's a strong foundation on this belief of self-determination, right? That the people who live in an area should be able to get together and decide for themselves how they want to govern their affairs, and that they should be able to do so without undue influence from other governments. They should have sovereignty. Okay. And again, these are aspirational goals. These aren't necessarily things that happen in the real world. This is what people who believe this ideology, this is what they think, right? And the principles of liberal internationalism sort of underpin these intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations. It's the foundation of why they're trying to do what they're trying to do. And this doesn't come without criticism or alternative ideologies. We'll talk about that here in a second, but we want to know what is the ideological foundation behind the existence of these organizations, right? So these organizations see disagreements between countries and between people as normal, right? Of course, country X and country Y are going to disagree because they have different the people living in those countries have different experiences, and they understand those experiences differently. They see the world through a different lens. And so disagreements are normal and to be expected. And that's what negotiation and discussion and diplomacy exists for, is to try and find places where countries can express those disagreements in a civil way, and it's not seen as confrontational. It's seen as dialogue and discussion. And another part of liberal internationalism is that this belief that the problems that the world has today are too big to solve by any one country alone. And that's why we need to have a coordinated response and a coordinated action, right? So take something like creating economic prosperity for all people around the world. That's a difficult task. It's something that one country can't achieve on its own. Look what happened throughout history when individual countries like Germany or Japan tried to create prosperity for themselves, for their own people at the expense of everybody else, right? So that we need to have coordinated response. Take something like climate change; it will affect all people. And so the idea is that how do you address something that everybody's responsible for and everybody will suffer from? You need to have coordinated action. And so the question that we have is for you today: Can countries have greater influence over the world acting alone or in concert with other nations? In other words, should you as an individual country like Canada, should we pursue our national interests individually, or should we go with our friends? Should we act unilaterally, or should we act multilaterally? And that's what we want to think about here today. So let's take a look at a couple of different issues, and then we'll talk about the ideology, and we'll talk about different perspectives on how do you create change, right? So let's look at something like climate change. Obviously, it's an issue that a lot of people care about, especially young people. Um, You've got right now globally the current parts per million, 407 parts per million. Scientists predict with the continued rate of expansion of our greenhouse gas emissions that we will have an average increase of 2 degrees centigrade by the time we get to 2050. And so that's obviously just an average. We know that some parts may experience greater changes and some places may experience less. But on average, that's the predicted increase. So to try and address this problem in the 1990s, people got together in Kyoto, which is a city in Japan, and they tried to hammer out an agreement on what countries would do to reduce their emissions. So keep in mind that this is over 20 years ago that they got together and they did this. And it's probably no surprise to you that most countries did not get close to the commitments that they made in Kyoto. So a few years ago, countries again assembled in Paris to hammer out the Paris Climate Accords. You're probably familiar with this. And countries agree to, again, certain commitments. And it's probably of no surprise to you that the majority of countries are not close to meeting their commitments that they made. So when we look at these agreements, there are many detractors of liberal internationalism who would say, these discussions that countries had where they got together in this international forum, there's some problems here, right? And they would say, for example, look, each country is going to be affected differently. And that means that certain countries are going to have different levels of commitment. So you might have a country like Canada, which is a cold country, right? We all live here. And we look at it and we go, well, hey, wait a second. If the earth warms up, we might actually, yes, we'll have some deserts created in Alberta and Saskatchewan, but we might open up the north to agricultural production because it's warmer, right? And so, on the whole, we might look at it and go, huh, maybe this is a relatively positive thing. And look, we've really only got a few cities that are next to the water compared to other countries. A city like Vancouver might have challenges, but Edmonton, Calgary, Regina, Winnipeg, not so much. So, a country like Canada might say, well, we care about this issue, but it's not an existential threat. We see ourselves as being able to adapt. That's our mindset. And then you could look at a country like Bangladesh, which is the average amount of what do you call it? The topography, the elevation of Bangladesh is going to be very low. Like it's just barely above sea level. There's lots of the country that's actually like below sea level. So if ice melts and we experience a rise in sea levels, most of Bangladesh could be underwater. And they already experienced trouble with floodings from the Ganges and the different rivers that flow through there, right? So they already have issues with flooding. Then on top of that, you have sea level rise. They might see this issue as way more of a problem than us. And so, because there's different levels of commitment as countries go into this, they might set agreements. They might say, like, yes, we're going to commit to produce this many greenhouse gases, but there's nothing that's we don't see it as a real immediate consequence if action isn't taken, and so therefore action is not taken, right? So that's what people who are against liberal internationalism would say is like, look, it's really hard to get 180 countries together to agree on an issue when they have different levels of commitment. And so we're talking about this through the lens of climate change, but this is a criticism that extends to other organizations and other attempts to make change. Now, on the other side of it is that proponents of liberal internationalism would say, look, hey, wait a second. Yes, we recognize this, but everybody is going to be affected by this issue, and one country can't make a difference by itself. So we need to have organizations and forums where people can get together and discuss these issues, because otherwise we won't make any headway, right? Then think about another criticism that liberal internationalism or detractors of it would have is they would say, look, everybody can agree to these things, but there's no mechanism for enforcement. There's no real teeth. There's no real consequence that any country that agrees to something for not following through. So, for example, certain countries that torture people have signed on to UN agreements against torture, but there's no way to actually do anything against these countries when they torture people. Not only that, they may have people who sit on the Human Rights Council and they're making decisions. So, what's the point of agreeing to something if there's no way to ensure that countries are actually following through and going through with these changes, right? On the other side is proponents of liberal internationalism. They're going to say, look, uh, at least we want countries to agree to these things, because in a democratic country, we can hold our leaders accountable to the commitments that they made. You can say, look, Mr. Trudeau, you signed on to the Paris Climate Accords, which committed Canada to make these changes. Although we have made some slowing down of the pace of change, we're still increasing overall our greenhouse gas emissions. And so then you can hold political leaders accountable for the things that they've committed to. In authoritarian regimes, you could say, look, these authoritarian regimes, they may not be holding to the commitments that they've made. But when people are advocating for change and saying this is why we need to get rid of, dictator X, here's a reason why. Dictator X said that they would do this and they haven't done that. And that gives us a reason to try and oppose the actions of this government, right? So, detractors of liberal internationalism, they might say, look, powerful countries shape these agreements to their benefit. So if you look at, for example, a country like the United States, which did originally sign on to the Paris Climate Accords when Obama was running the country, um, they look, the United States, as the richest, most developed economy on earth, probably could have done more. But there were special carve outs in the agreement that protected particular industries within the United States, that protected the United States in certain sort of trade negotiations. There was ways that the United States used its power to make the agreement acceptable to it, and it probably watered down the overall agreement, right? Because that's the way that you get a big country to sign on, is by giving concessions. Now, the other side of it is proponents of liberal internationalism would say, yeah, but that's okay that we're making concessions for those powerful countries because we need them to get on board too. We can't make any headway against this issue with them on the sidelines, right? So, detractors of liberal internationalism, they would also say, look, transnational corporations are going to actively seek to undermine these agreements between states. So, for example, while the United States was signing on to these climate agreements, there were corporations that were funding disinformation campaigns in the United States about climate change, right? So, what's the point of governments making these agreements if transnational corporations, these powerful entities, also aren't in agreement? And look, proponents of liberal internationalism would say, look, states still have the ability to force these corporations into compliance within their borders, right? They do have some power to be able to compel these corporations to act in certain ways. Again, you could go back and forth, back and forth. All that we're trying to do here is give you some sense of the different positions that people would have about these agreements and these organizations, and the principles of liberal internationalism that underpin these sorts of agreements and organizations. Right? We're just trying to give you a sense of what people might argue, not every single argument or how somebody would come back to that. The goal is just to give you some sense of what's out there and what people would say. Take an issue like malaria, right? It's a global disease. You can see here over 200 million people contract malaria every year. Over 400,000 people die. It's a big factor for continuing poverty in developing countries because malaria, though, kills people. You can see most people don't die from malaria. They just get sick from malaria, and you can't really do anything when you have malaria. You're just basically bedridden. So think about the economic output. If you guys are seeing that right now with COVID, right? Like when you're sitting at home, you're not very productive, even if you're working from home. Maybe you're an insurance adjuster or an insurance salesman. You probably can't do much from home as you would if you were out there doing things. So there's economic consequences to this in developing countries. It's a big contributing reason to why developing countries have a hard time creating economic prosperity for their people. So, liberal international organizations, charities, things like that, they've all, governments have tried to get together and figure out a way to solve this problem of malaria, right? And so, what would people say about dealing with an issue like malaria? Well, there's detractors of liberal internationalism who might even say, why are you even worried about malaria in some other part of the world? We've got homeless people here in Canada. We've got indigenous people who have poor conditions on reserves. Why are we worried about people, some other part of the world, and how they're suffering with malaria? The other side to that is liberal internationalists would argue and they'd say, but look, hey, wait a second. We know that when people have terrible, miserable lives in other parts of the world, it affects us because they can't buy our stuff. So, if people don't have money in some part of Africa or South America or Asia because of malaria, we could be selling more of our goods to them, and that will enrich and benefit our society itself. In addition, many of these countries are insecure, they're unstable, and that can fuel terrorist groups that might, want to hurt people here in Canada. And so it's good for our own security if people in other parts of the world have a good life. And so that would be their counter argument. And again, you can go back and forth, but trying to give you some sense of what people would say. So detractors of liberal internationalism, they might say, look, again, powerful countries can shape the foreign aid to benefit themselves rather than the recipient countries. So this is a classic example with malaria, where countries like Canada were funding anti-malarial drugs and research into, like, okay, if you take this pill, it will prevent malaria from keeping you down and keeping you sick, so you can get back to work. But obviously, Canada benefits from that because that employs scientists and research. Eventually, when drugs are developed, we're able to sell those drugs to other governments, other countries, other NGOs, and we turn a profit, and that fuels economic prosperity with our own country. So they did a bunch of research, and so far, the most effective thing that's ever worked against malaria is mosquito nets, and they cost about $2. And because they're so inexpensive, lots of countries were like, we're not going to buy mosquito nets. Like, even though these people are poor, they can afford a mosquito net for $2 and they should buy one. But lots of people, they just wouldn't buy them. So then what non-governmental organizations started to do is they were like, we're just going to give people mosquito nets, drastically reduce the amount of, or the incidence of malaria in many of these countries. Okay. So powerful countries try to shape these agreements and try to shape these issues to their benefit. Now, the other side of it is, look, powerful countries have the expertise and the technological capacity to help. And you might say, well, although mosquito nets are useful and they help reduce the incidence of malaria, they haven't eliminated malaria. And look at something like smallpox. We eliminated smallpox because powerful countries developed vaccines, they gave that technology to other developing countries, and now we don't have to deal with smallpox. All right. The other part of it is, there's a lot of hubris. People think they can solve problems, and sometimes they just create new problems. So, for example, the original idea of dealing with malaria was to use a spray called DDT, and you may have learned of this in your science classes. So they went out and sprayed DDT. It killed mosquitoes, and therefore it reduced the incidence of malaria. But the downside is that DDT became biomagnified in the ecosystems. So little tiny organisms had a little bit of it, and as you went up the food chain, then birds started to have high concentrations of DDT in their bodies. And with those high concentrations of DDT, they couldn't form eggshells properly, and when they would go to nest, they would break their embryos, and basically it was a form of drastic population restriction on the birds. And when the birds actually started dying, some of them went extinct, some of them became endangered. And often these birds were the things that were eating the mosquitoes in the first place that reduced their numbers. So, in the short term, it looked like a good solution to the problem, but in the long term, it was disastrous. And so now there's this idea that we should genetically engineer mosquitoes to be able to do the same thing. And there are other people out there, scientists, who are saying, well, wait a second, look at this experience. Maybe we should think about this a little bit more, about the implications of what we are doing in the long term. Okay. Now, liberal internationalism would say, look, it's better for us to try something than to not try at all, right? Like, so yeah, we may cause problems when we go out and try and solve these things, but just sitting back and doing nothing is morally unacceptable, right? Okay, so the final perspective that we're going to try and give you is looking at something like emergency assistance. So, what happens when there's an earthquake or a hurricane? And so you could take a look at an NGO like the Red Cross. So it has over 2 billion in revenue. It operates in a lot of countries, 90 different countries. It helped out here in Alberta when there was the Fort McMurray fires. It's helped out in the Haiti earthquakes. And so it seems like a pretty benevolent organization trying to do good, but there's still detractors, right? So first of all, there's nobody who can be held accountable when mistakes are made. So you can look at different disaster areas where the Red Cross has made mistakes. Um, but yeah, nobody was ever held responsible because, hey, look, it's just they didn't do anything criminally wrong. They just didn't have the right plan in place to help the people when this disaster happened, right? Now, proponents of liberal internationalism would say, well, look, hey, no country wants to sit there and spend billions of dollars a year to have emergency disaster preparedness ready, because that's really expensive for something you may never use. Like, you may never have a disaster that warrants the creation of this organization within a country. So why would you create it in the first place? And then so no countries have any disaster preparedness. And so that's where something like the Red Cross steps in because, hey, here's this thing that can help any country when it doesn't think it's ever going to need to use that type of assistance, right? Um, It'd be like, for example, nobody goes and buys a tow truck because they think their car is going to break down in the winter. But most people have, AMA or some type of roadside assistance insurance that protects them in case that does happen to their car, right? It's like, you pay a little bit each month so that if you do need it, you can use it rather than like paying a huge amount for something you may never need. All right. So detractors of liberal internationalism, they say like, look, an NGO like the Red Cross, it's not a democratic organization. People don't have like you can donate it, and I guess you can kind of vote with your dollars. But there's once you give your money to an organization, there's no way to influence the decisions that it makes. And so it may make decisions in ways that are sort of opaque and not very clear. Now, proponents of liberal internationalism would say because of that, they're also not influenced in the same way that political leaders and governments are, and they can go into places where governments are not willing to. And so you may have seen, for example, in grade 10, when you looked at Rwanda, um, that all these governments were pulling out. Belgium is pulling out. The United States is pulling out. And who stayed? The Red Cross stayed, right? So the Red Cross was responsible for saving, tens of thousands of lives in Rwanda during the genocide because they were able to stay and they weren't susceptible to the same types of political calculations that states and governments are susceptible to. So detractors of liberal internationalism might also talk about how money can be misused or mismanaged. So, for example, the CEO of the Red Cross makes millions of dollars a year. Um, Now, at the same time, there to just so you guys know, there is an argument about why. It's because think about you have this NGO that's a $2 billion sort of NGO, and you can't have just any old person being the leader of that organization. So you need to offer at least a somewhat competitive salary for the top level people so that the organization can function in a good way, right? So that's the argument for it. So just so you guys know, there is that. So they might talk about that. Look, hey, liberal detractors say the money can be misused. Now, proponents of liberal international might counter and they might say, look, these types of organizations contribute to the development of a global civil society where people feel connected to each other and they're making contributions and they're making change to make the world a better place. All right. So with that, what we have done here today is talked about what are in our international organizations. What are the two different types of international organizations? You have intergovernmental organizations. You have non-governmental organizations. And what we've also done is we've talked about some of the perspectives that exist about whether those organizations are a good thing or a bad thing, and give you some sense of the conversation that exists here around these organizations. So now what you'll do is you'll take a look at your task for this week. Again, Please, if you do need us for anything at all, get in touch with us. We're happy to help you. We want to help you. Hopefully, take care of yourselves, and we'll see you again here soon. All right. Take care, guys. Bye.